Hello and welcome to this video on Tolkien's Orcs. These barbarian, human-like creatures would be familiar to anyone who has read Tolkien's works or watched the movies by Peter Jackson. Orcs are the backbone of Sauron's army, and in fact often the backbone of any fictional universe with a evil fantasy setting. They provide the fighting strength and occasional rations for larger creatures needed to conquer Middle-earth. Despite repeatedly being defeated, the Orcs survived in the deep caves, pits, chambers, and tunnels of the large fortresses in which they lived. They have both a lore background and a reasonably interpreted biology and physiology. Both of these can be dissected and understood. Orcs are summarily described as follows. They are cruel, sadistic, black-hearted, vicious, and hateful of everything and everyone. They particularly dislike order and success. Physically, as a race, they are short. They are roughly humanoid in shape. Being short and humanoid, they're also often squat, have a broad, flat face, sallow skin, legs that bow, a wide mouth, slanted eyes, very long arms, and dark skin. Their teeth are almost like fangs. On rare occasion, some of them are described as being almost man-high, and some as little as a hobbit. Some are described as having a darkened and dirty skin, and overall the race is considered disgusting by the other races of Middle-earth. They are not likely to create anything of artisanal value, although sometimes they are able to demonstrate engineering and manufacturing prowess when it comes to machines, tools, weapons, and other less delightful instruments. They found that working with machinery and similar was the most satisfying of actions they could be involved with. They also enjoyed exploding things and working with wheels, which led to them having a much greater interest in tunneling and mining than other races, barring the dwarves. It's said that the Orcs were created by Melkor by modifying elves, that this process developed a hatred for both themselves and a deep hatred for both Melkor and anything else that lived. This led to them becoming extremely violent and warlike. As noted, the Orcs have at least some capacity to be industrious and creative, and this meant that although their weapons and similar were nowhere near comparable to the elves, or even some of the free peoples of Middle-earth, they were still able to produce things that would, in most cases, have been impossible for the race as underdeveloped as they were. As we've mentioned, they were described as being smaller than men, having a crooked frame, and being distorted in their height. This often means it's hard to establish just how they were physically. This physical appearance and some of the incongruity in it makes it difficult to figure out just exactly whether or not they were weakened by sunlight or afraid of it. There's a question as to whether or not it is a physical weakness when exposed to sunlight or the psychological impact, and Tolkien provides no specific direction on which of these it is. They appear to have developed no specific ability to adapt to the darkness in which they generally lived, often using artificial light. It is said some of the Orcs are either very long-lived, like the last of the Númenóreans, namely Aragorn, with at least one living to 150 years. In other cases it's said that they have only an average lifespan, but breed prolifically like rabbits. Knowing this about the more established lore of Tolkien's Orcs, we can establish how they came to be, which is almost as important. The elves are said to have been made by Ilúvatar. Then the great evil of Tolkien's works, Melkor, kidnapped them and tortured them until they became Orcs. This is the first problem. How do you turn an elf into an Orc? It takes a lot to turn an almost, if not immortal creature of light into a twisted, distorted, and dark creature. Effectively, a sort of evolution or devolution, which requires thousands of minor changes over a period of time. If we were speaking of a reality that follows the normal rules of evolution, This process would take thousands of generations. Tolkien's world has a sort of cheat, if you will, an advantage. That is, magic can speed up this process, and it is noted in his expanded works that while only Iluvatar can make life, Melkor could distort it. The changes needed to make an orc and the claim process would inevitably create a cruel, sadistic, black-hearted, vicious, and hateful species. It's said that the elves were kidnapped and tortured. It's unclear if torture in this case is a reference to a physical process or a description of distorting their physical creation, which led to them turning into an orc. Either way, such cruel treatment would over many generations create a society of individuals that are cruel, sadistic, black-hearted, vicious, and hateful. In both cultures and small regions with endemic multi-generational violence, neglect, and worse, such as we see with the orcs, there is a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. The physical changes seen are also very interesting. Elves are generally tall, fair-skinned, and light-haired. There, of course, being exceptions depending on which particular line you're looking at. Their limbs are straight and elegant. The orcs are short, dark-skinned and dark-haired. Their limbs are awkwardly bowed. Some were considered quite tall at the height of a human, which in Tolkien's world would be similar to the average male in our world, at 175 centimeters or 5 feet and 11 inches. This also means anything smaller would be more common. As mentioned, they could easily have been as small as a hobbit, since at one point we see them hiding in amongst the ranks of the orcs on their way to Mordor. This creates a society of short, violent, and unhealthy creatures that are not part of the hobbit family. How they came to be this way would be or could be very simply explained by diet, nutrition, and development. In our world, children and adults with poor nourishment often grow in a stunted way. They also often develop physical issues, such as being bow-legged. This is known as rickets disease. It is a bone-weakening and softening disease caused by vitamin D deficiencies. It causes the legs to become bowed. It can also cause delayed growth and neurological issues. How the orcs multiply is less clear. They most likely follow a process of sexual reproduction, as they can change and mutate. This is demonstrated by some of the famous albino orcs. Elves are shown to reproduce sexually but at very low rates of birth, while orcs are much more virile and proliferative. It is unlikely that the orcs would have deviated from this process. The orcs are said to struggle in sunlight, where they become weak. As we've mentioned, it's not clear if this is a physical reaction to the light or a psychological response to being out from under the darkness of Mordor. If it is a physical reaction, then it may owe to their dark skin, which less effectively absorbs light. This in turn causes less activation of vitamin D. Sudden exposure to an increased amount of light after a prolonged period of protection from sunlight could cause physical weakness. This is most commonly known colloquially as sunstrike, but there are other reasons why it does have this effect. Your body will try to constantly maintain a state of homeostasis. One of the problems it often faces in that is controlling the body's heat. In order to control heat, it actually has to use a lot more energy in trying to get rid of it, whether through sweat, dumping that heat into other parts of the body, and so on. Using so much effort and having to dedicate so much of the metabolic process to it can often have the effect of causing extreme fatigue. Then there are issues with the chemistry of the body. Ultraviolet light, which wasn't as well known during Tolkien's time, can cause a lot of damage. The process of this damage and the body's attempt to repair it when it happens, such as sunburn, can result in a whole lot of chemical changes, and that these can lead to fatigue as well. There is a final possibility. This is a pathological state, and it is something known as porphyria, or it could well be something very similar to porphyria, but only found within Tolkien's universe. Porphyria is a group of disorders that are the result of the buildup of chemicals under the skin and the body. These porphyrins, as they're known, are normally required for the function of hemoglobin. That's all well and good. Porphyrin helps to bind iron and carry oxygen. If you get high levels of porphyrin in the body, they can actually have adverse effects. In the case of porphyria as a disease, these porphyrins build up under the skin. They are then released when exposed to sunlight. This means that whilst in mortar and protected by the darkness, orcs would not see the effect, but once they leave mortar and are exposed to sunlight, they would be weakened by it. These are all reasonably normal processes in humans, and the probability of life like this is not unreasonable, just very unlikely, as nearly all the conditions are adverse to life, and the fact that they're not dying almost immediately from it, or very slowly, is somewhat more difficult to swallow. We said at the start that elves and orcs are related, but there are also some very obvious differences. Elves do not die from anything that is considered a natural cause. Fundamentally, they'll pass away for one of two reasons: violence or from melancholy. Orcs die, it appears, from old age, a number of other conditions, starvation and so on. It then raises the question, how did the orcs deviate so much from the elves that they live much shorter lives? It would seem that for some reason the elves had a way of keeping their bodies eternally young, or close enough to, that they would never have to worry about the implications of aging. Orcs, on the other hand, appear to age, and this means that they have to develop processes where their cells and organs undergo a process of gradual deterioration. We see this in humans, where it seems far more likely to be a possibility in orcs, and in fact it's the elves that are almost entirely impossible. We said that the orcs were capable of industry, but not able to be artisans. There were, according to the works of Tolkien, many clever orcs, ones able to produce machines, tools, weapons, and more, that they were able to work with these and find some happiness in them. This means that they must have had some way to keep their mind to some extent. The elves were known for crafting beautiful art and industry. In fact, one of the elves is behind the crafting of the three rings that Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf bear. That the orcs don't have this level of capacity, whether in art or industry, would indicate that they've regressed quite significantly. If they were derived from the elves, when they were at a point where they could still manufacture something more diverse products than the free men of Middle-earth, but not the same level as the elves, and it would appear that the orcs have simply fallen further from that point. They appear to have been partially driven to develop these skills at a rudimentary level, that has then stagnated. After all, once they could hide in the caves, away from sunlight, they had no need for anything more advanced. They eventually were driven to create weapons of some sort, if only to wage war on the other races of Middle-earth. Other than that, they have regressed in evolutionary terms from the elves to something more fundamental and barbaric. Orcs appear to be very sick and socially destructed as a society. Think idiocracy when you consider their regression from the elves. They have no special abilities as such, but surviving somehow. The fact that they need torches and other light to travel at night, despite preferring the dark and largely living in it, means that they appear to have developed no way of compensating for all of the adverse ways they live their life. As a general rule, in evolutionary terms, a species that can't adapt and meet the needs of the new environment will not survive for very long. In Tolkien's world and The Lord of the Rings specifically, it would appear that their survival is driven almost entirely by Sauron, and earlier by Melkor. This may have removed some of the selective pressures that their race faced. it still doesn't explain how they can keep going and how they breed so widely. From what we've read, the orcs are a race that is artificially kept in a semi-barbaric state. Despite this, they have accrued culture, ability to create, and more. This has led us to believe that perhaps they have simply developed an endemic disease and conditions that affect every member, and that this often explains some of the conditions and situations we see in the lore. Overall, orcs are entirely possible, although you need to make several rather large leaps in logic to get from their initial early lore, which was not fully fleshed out by Tolkien, and the final state that we see in much of his later works. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.